Hi. Some of you, this may be the first time you've actually seen my face, but I look forward to meeting you this next upcoming class on Tuesday. Um, this is English 201, Principles of Literary Study. You should be able to log into our supplemental course site on Sakai, where you can download the syllabus for the class. What I want to do in this first introductory video is just give a quick overview of what we'll be doing this semester. And then in the next two videos, I'm going to review the first quote-unquote methodology. I said quote-unquote and then did quotes, whatever. Methodology of approaching and studying literature. That we'll be covering in this class called New Criticism, or The New Criticism, sometimes awkwardly. And then in the third video in this first series, I'll be looking at a poem that we read in class and tried to work with in a kind of new critical, or what's also called, in a formalist sort of way. So to try to model that approach to literature. So anyway, in other words, we're sort of diving right into the content of the class. And in some sense that's necessary because we have a lot of ground to cover over the next 12 or 13 weeks. So, okay, so in this first video, I'm just going to read through the course description, point out a few things in the syllabus for you to notice, and then, of course, on the syllabus is my contact information. So if you have questions, you're welcome to call me or write to me, So anyway, okay, without further ado, course description. This course will introduce you to several methods and frameworks for the study of literature and literary history. Moreover, it will familiarize you with the historical and conceptual relations, tensions, developments, and oppositions within and between these methods. Starting with the rise of New Criticism in the 1930s, and moving up to recent work in queer and post-colonial studies, we will track the major concerns and consequences of these frameworks. I want you to keep in mind those two words, concerns and consequences. I'll follow up on that in just a minute. In doing so, we will also be gathering and cultivating a great variety of critical and creative tools for our own present and future projects. These tools will not only aid us in the study of literature, but also in any future study of culture, history, identity, politics, and media that we may take up one day. In this sense, we could retitle this course, English 201, Varieties of Reading and Critical Thinking. In addition to Robert Dale Parker's How to Interpret Literature, that's this one. It looks thin, but there's a lot of stuff here. This is our primary textbook. We will also be studying two novels. I'm turning my phone off so it doesn't interrupt me here. The first, which we'll be discussing this coming Tuesday, so be sure to read it in its entirety, is Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, one of my favorite novels. And later in the semester, in the last 4 weeks or so, we'll be reading Noah Larson's Passing. You need to get these copies of the books. With Woolf, I'll be a bit more forgiving, but with Larson, you need this copy because technically only about that much of the book is Larson's novella. The rest of it is historical and contextual material, news reports, book reviews that were contemporary to the novel, and also really the bulk of the last material is a kind of survey of criticism, of literary criticism that focuses on Noah Larson's Passing. And since this is a class on literary criticism, we'll be spending several weeks reading through that material. It would probably be pretty hard to track down all that material on your own, so it's probably best to just go ahead and buy that copy. So anyway, so 3 books. That's not too bad, I think. So with that in mind, I'll let you read the rest of the syllabus on your own, including the breakdown of the grades. And if you have any questions, please write to me or call me ASAP so we can straighten out any confusion that there might be. Okay, so really quickly, if you look at this book, really, just scan at the table of contents of this book. What you'll notice is that this book, like most most undergraduate textbooks in literary theory and criticism is broken down into what is sometimes mistakenly called schools or methods, right? And so I just want to quickly read through them. I'm not going to define all of them. Just sort of give you an overview of what I'm going to call the schools of criticism, emphasis on those quotation marks. Okay. So the first, which I'll be covering in this video lecture series, in which we talked about last Tuesday, is new criticism, and I'll develop that a little bit more later. The next is structuralism. Then something called deconstruction, which my students from last semester will be somewhat familiar with. Next is psychoanalysis, feminism, queer studies, Marxism, historicism and cultural studies, and post-colonial studies, and also race studies. There's, of course, all sorts of other schools or methods that one could cover. The last chapter of this book, for instance, which we probably won't have time to go over, reader response. But there's also, over the last 10 or 15 years, a real kind of unraveling and disaggregation of English into all sorts of what you might think of as lateral groupings, right? So there's something now called posthumanism, right? Or animal studies, or or eco-criticism, for instance. So we won't really have time to talk about those things, but there's I just want you to know that there's far more than that grouping of methods or schools. So a word really quickly about method, right? Because when we think about that in terms of the sciences, or at least the version of the sciences that we learn in elementary school and high school, we learn about a thing called the scientific method, right? And we also are taught why, or at least I was taught. Maybe I shouldn't include all of us in this, but at least when I was taking science as a elementary student, high school student, and even an undergraduate student, I was taught that the scientific method was important because it's important that science is capable of reproducing and repeating results of experiments that are meant to corroborate or test complex theories, right? And if one follows the scientific method over and over and over again and gets different sorts of results, that means that one might have to go back and kind of rework one's theory, or look more closely at how one is conducting the experiment to see if there's variations entering into it that are sort of muddying up the works, right? But in a kind of really layperson's way, the point of the scientific method is that if anybody follows one experiment, they will always come out with the same result. As many of you probably can already intuit, this is not the case in the methodologies, quote unquote methodologies, that we'll be going over this semester. The point is not to set up a series of steps that will always lead different readers to the same interpretations of a poem or a novel or something else. So what I want you to do every time I refer to one of these many headings that I just went over, whenever I refer to it as a method or a school, what I want you to think about is not so much a series of steps that one follows in order to achieve a sort of desired goal, a goal that everybody in the class should come to if they follow those steps. But what I want you to think is rather a kind of odd clustering of concerns and questions and concepts and competing ideas and limitations and consequences and sensitivities and optics, right? Ways of seeing, ways of asking questions. Because, even if you look at something like feminism, for instance, which has historically, in some sense, been a kind of political movement, also an ethical movement in some sense. to give a mode of reading that name feminism is to give it a name that once we start putting pressure on it, we see is actually a really fraught field of ideas and concepts that can be useful in all sorts of ways, right? Anybody who's studied the history of feminism knows that there's not just, first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, but now a kind of multiplicity of feminisms all over the globe, right? Many of which, in some sense, maybe without intending to, end up competing with each other, obscuring each other. All the while, of course, the hope is that they sort of unify and work together. But my point is here that there's no such thing as a single feminist methodology, but rather that word and that category, when we apply it to a mode of reading or a mode of study or a mode of approaching a text with certain questions or ideas, or attempting to see certain blind spots in it, that what we're actually talking about is something more like a nexus of collaborative and competing ideas and concerns and concepts, and again, limitations and consequences. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that these headings that I just went over overlap with each other. So there is such thing as a sort of feminist theorist or a feminist critic of literature or culture that also is in a way maybe a psychoanalyst, or also a deconstructivist, or also a historicist, or also a queer theorist, or also very interested in race, or also at times, depending on what the text is, maybe something of a formalist. Gasp, even. So again, what I want you to keep in mind that these headings are a kind of way for us to get a handle on what is actually a very messy and complicated history. A way to kind of group together like-minded figures, like-minded thinkers and critics and theorists, who nevertheless kind of like travel in between these headings. And so you'll actually see that in Parker's book, that, sort of the heavy hitters, like someone like Foucault, for instance, will appear in a few of the chapters that he talks about in this book, or that he'll cover in this book. So don't be confused by that. When you see Foucault show up in the queer studies chapter and then later in the historicist chapter, don't be like, well, wait, I thought he was a queer theorist, so why is he, showing up here too? And he's probably also mentioned in the structuralist chapter too. So anyway, that's what I want to say now. Just sort of end that quick overview there. So again, just to summarize, when I talk about a methodology or when I talk about a school of criticism, what I don't want you to think about is a kind of fixed set of steps for approaching literature, enabling each reader to come to the same conclusion about what a text means or what it does. But rather what I want you to think about is a kind of complex nexus of thinkers, figures, interests, concerns, consequences, limitations, questions, problems, ideas that sometimes collaborate, sometimes compete, sometimes are in opposition in some sense to one another. And not to see that as a problem, right? Not something that needs resolution or needs fixing, but that is partly what makes the study of literature and the study of culture and the study of media so worthwhile, right? Knowing that there's these rich histories of ideas and approaches to texts, and so it's that history, that story of that messiness that we'll be going over this semester and actually experimenting with in our own discussions about the literature that we'll be reading. So anyway, so in my next video, I'll be reviewing a lecture I gave on the first day of class. It's mostly a written lecture, so if it's a bit stilted, I apologize. And then in the third video, I think that's how this is going to work. In the third video, I'll be looking at a very specific poem, a carefully selected poem that we also talked about in class on Tuesday. Okay?